Yeah, I suppose the big one to start with is everyone is talking about it more openly now. Russia as a durable threat to European security, no longer just maybe viewed as a competitor or kind of a nebulous actor that we discuss obliquely in policy documents. It's now being openly stated that Russia is the primary threat to European security. So, how does that shape the European security environment in maybe ways beyond the obvious headlines of threats of nuclear war or the prospect of major fighting in the Baltics? How is that shaping the security environment in Europe generally?
Of course, we have Russia's continued war in Ukraine, which very much continues to shape Europe's security environment. And having an active open conflict on the European continent obviously has lots of political and economic effects for Europe. Europe has continues to support Ukraine, and the European Union's just committed 105 billion euros to assisting Ukraine without dipping into Russian frozen assets, mind you. So that war continues to shape the European security environment and also the European security consciousness, where states are looking at how Russia is fighting in Ukraine and making decisions about military capabilities based on what they're seeing in the Ukrainian theater. We're also seeing Russian hybrid threats, and whether that's drone attacks, supply chain sabotage, cyber attacks, election interference, as we saw in Moldova. I think this is something that, regardless of the resolution of the war in Ukraine, that this would be something that we would continue to see emanating from Russia. It happened before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and I think it would be the kind of aggressive activity that Russia, under its present regime, would be inclined to continue. And of course, we're looking at the map of Europe. European NATO allies, particularly those in the East, will be feeling particularly vulnerable. And that certainly shapes our perception of what activity Russia could take next. The second order effects for UK national security, I think, will be a shift away from concentrating elsewhere in the world or extending global presence to really focus much more on what is happening in Europe and in the UK supporting its European NATO allies, rather than trying to have a presence in the Indo-Pacific, for example, or trying to have a presence in the Middle East, contributing to stabilization missions or things like that. I think a lot more of that attention is going to be focused on Europe and on Eastern Europe. The UK also needs to consider how it strengthens its defenses against Russian hybrid threats, particularly in cyberspace, and particularly things like supply chain security and border security.
So I'm actually going to go a little bit out of order here with the question because I
All
think
right.
this segues a bit better. What are the most plausible escalation pathways below the threshold of open war? You've mentioned, of course, and we've all seen the various Russian campaigns of sabotage, some of which have been pretty daring. I think we all wonder what might have happened if, for instance, the attempted bombing of those cargo airliners had actually come off. So when you look at potential escalation pathways below Russian tanks trying to reach the suburbs of Tallinn, where do you see the likely threats coming from?
Sorry, can I just jump in here ahead of you, Louise? Luke, just a
Sure.
quick one for anybody listening. Could you very briefly run through Russian sabotage and bombing of cargo planes, just so people know what we're talking about?
Ah,
And then,
right. I don't have the full articles in front of me, but there was a Russian plot which was disrupted, I believe late last year, to plant bombs on a number of cargo planes. These were concealed within the kind of ordinary packages that get shipped by air freight all over Europe. And the jig was up when many of these detonated prematurely in their depots. But had they been rigged or fused correctly, some experts at least believe that they would have detonated in flight aboard these planes with, of course, substantial disruption to the cargo freight that is pretty load bearing for European and global supply chains. I think we can all see how that might have been a substantial step up, even from Russian drone activity over certain European airports recently that grounded flights, or various other acts of sabotage for hire that the Russians have been undertaking in various countries, generally engaging criminal actors through Telegram. So that's what I'm referencing with this question, of course. When we talk about escalation pathways, I find it hard to believe that even Moscow could really predict how European countries might react to something of that magnitude. So when we think about escalation beyond a sudden conventional military bolt from the blue, what pathways are you looking out for?
So, similar to you, I probably wouldn't speculate on how various European states would respond to an escalation or a perceived escalation. But what I would look at is plausible escalation pathways. I think when we're talking about hybrid war, Russia is going to look for, those soft targets. They're going to look for existing vulnerabilities. Driving a tank into Talon is pretty, it's going to provoke quite a predictable response. So maybe it wouldn't do that. But they look at, say, European supply chains are really vulnerable due to open borders and the free movement of goods across Europe. There aren't as many security checks as there should be on cargo. The amount of e-commerce, just the sheer volume of packages that crisscross Europe on a daily basis makes it quite difficult for cargo to move efficiently and also securely. Another big vulnerability is the cyber domain. European states, with a few notable exceptions, are highly digitized. European populations rely very much on digital banking, digital communication. When is the last time that any of the three of us are going and paying for things in cash? Probably hasn't happened all that recently. Destabilizing or interfering with banking systems. Also looking at other parts of the European continent, not necessarily European NATO countries or European Union countries, but areas like Transnistria or Moldova or even Georgia, and seeing how they can foment dissent, perhaps install or promote a pro-Russian regime.
I guess naturally coming on the heels of that is the question of deterrence. Obviously, the safest way to avoid any of this being tested is to deter these activities before they begin. So where on the part of Europe is deterring Russia working well, and where is it brittle? And that's across all domains, from the military one to political cohesion, industrial capacity, public resilience. Where is Europe scoring well, and where does it have a lot of room to improve?
Across the board, Europe has a lot of room to improve. I think number one, probably military capability. We've got a big gap between what European militaries need to be capable of doing and what they're currently capable of doing and sustaining, more importantly, as well as political cohesion. What I was saying earlier about having a clear strategic objective and being able to clearly articulate that to a population, and having the social cohesion to know that those kinds of strategic objectives are understood and supported by European populations. I think despite nearly 4 years of a war on the European continent, a lot of day-to-day life for many Europeans probably hasn't changed that much. So are we really deterring Russia, or do we just have some inherent vulnerabilities that we haven't really been willing to address? So I would say across the board, Europe has a lot of room to improve. Number one, military capability. We've got a big gap between what European militaries need to be capable of doing and what they're currently capable of doing and sustaining, more importantly. What I was saying earlier about having a clear strategic objective and being able to clearly articulate that to a population, and having the social cohesion to know that those kinds of strategic objectives are understood and supported by European populations. And really, I think despite nearly 4 years of a war on the European continent, a lot of day-to-day life for many Europeans probably hasn't changed that much. So are we really deterring Russia, or do we just have some inherent vulnerabilities that we haven't really been willing to address?
That's a very good question, a very loaded question, but I've got my own answers. I'm sure most listeners will too. I think lastly, this might be the most expansive question for this section. How do we think that the risk environment changes between the current phase of open conflict in Ukraine and any kind of hypothetical post-war phase, when perhaps that immediate threat of conflict in Ukraine to focus the mind has been taken away? Do we start to see maybe drift in Europe's cohesive approach? And do we start to see maybe a difference in opinion in how quickly or if Europe should re-engage with Russia at all? In other words, what kind of hidden risks would any kind of settlement to the war in Ukraine pose to a long-term European shift to bolster its security? Obviously, that's a very big question, but if you could take a stab at it, I'd appreciate it.
All right. Well, I think, as you say, questions of a potential resolution to the war in Ukraine and the Trump administration's various peace plan options, we could do a whole other podcast episode just on that, maybe several. But coming back to your question, I think we have to distinguish between the current period and then any hypothetical post-war phase. So we have to acknowledge that despite multiple sanctions packages, are we at round 19 now? Russia is not fully cut off from Europe. Europe still imports a number of commodities from Russia, although most of these will be phased out by 2028. However, that's still another 2 years away. And we do see fracturing within Europe over the perception of the Russian threat. So Eastern European states that border Russia typically perceive Russia as an existential threat that necessitates maximum deterrence, where the further west we go, we see that states maintain perhaps a more cautious and even ambivalent approach. Then in Italy and Slovakia, there's been some voicing of growing public fatigue with the current security situation in Europe. And we have Hungary that openly defies European sanctions. So we already see fracturing within Europe regarding that relationship with Russia. Post-war, what constitutes an acceptable relationship with Russia will depend a lot on what shape a ceasefire agreement or peace agreement takes. So, for instance, if the war in Ukraine ends up with a ceasefire and some sort of frozen conflict, reminiscent of the situation in the Donbass from 2014 to 2022, probably sanctions on Russia might not relax, and Russia would still be treated as a pariah by certain European countries, while others might be more open to cooperation and commodities trade. If it was another type of peace agreement, or even one that eventually led, perhaps, to a regime change in Russia, I think we would see the relationship with Russia taking a very different course.